Good afternoon and welcome to the RespectAbility webinar for Thursday, September 20th, 2018. My name is Philip Kahn-Polly. I am the Policy and Practices Director for RespectAbility. I am so delighted to be here today. I never actually thought in my life growing up that I actually have the chance to share the stage virtually with Clarence Page and Eleanor Clift. As you can imagine from my profession, I was a nerdy little kid, and as a nerdy little kid, I watched the McLaughlin Group pretty regularly back in the day, and Clarence and Eleanor were mainstays of that iconic Washington show, and they talked about the issues of the day, that show for decades, and I'm so delighted to be here today because we're talking about a critically important issue of today, which is jobs for people with disabilities. As the banner said, today's presentation is going to be talking about writing op-eds on the issue of jobs for people with disabilities. As some of you may know, next month is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and because it's a great news hook, we are actively encouraging folks who care about this issue to get out there and tell their story, to the local newspaper. And to do that, we're getting you some professional advice, some writing coaching from two of Washington's iconic writers. Jennifer's not going to be joining us today because she's got to carry on our mission, but we have, first up, Eleanor Clift, who is a member of RespectAbility's Board of Directors, and she is a renowned journalist who has written multiple books on multiple different topics. She currently contributes to the Daily Beast. She covers politics, she covers culture, and she is, as I said, just an old Washington hand, and so delighted to be here with you today, Eleanor.
Well, glad to be with you all. And I must say, when it comes to opinion writing, I defer to Clarence Page, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner when it comes to opinion writing. I am basically a reporter, and I have had to teach myself how to become more opinionated when I write a column. I think there are some simple rules that I apply to myself. The lead for a news story, and I think it's probably also true for an op-ed column, is that the lead is what you would tell your family over supper that evening. In other words, it's the most important thing that pops to mind. And when you want to write an op-ed column, an op-ed stands for opposite the editorial page in a newspaper. So it's supposed to be opinion, it's supposed to be personal, it's supposed to be passionate and powerful, and it's also supposed to be short. 800 words is kind of the upper limit, 750 preferred, and for anybody who wants to write an op-ed, I would suggest initially reading some of the op-eds in the newspaper and reading the writing of some of the people that you might admire. My late husband, who was a journalist, would always tell me not to use overly complicated words. In other words, don't write a yellow elongated fruit when you want to say banana. And I've always kind of kept that in mind. And you want to sort of screen out the veries and too many adverbs. You want kind of simple, punchy language, and I think that, and the starting point, however, for anyone is you have to have an idea. And when I have an idea, what I do is I then brainstorm with myself, and I will, jot down the idea, and then I will jot down what comes to mind. And sometimes, not always, that evolves into an outline. And I always have to be careful not to rely on what's called the passive voice too much. You want active verbs because they just get people's attention. And this specific topic of advocating for jobs for people with disabilities, if you have a personal story you want to bring out, that's also very important. People who run op-eds and who decide what's going to get printed are going to be moved by a personal story. So a personal story of success or a personal story of being let down, why it mattered, how it made you feel, And then if you can bring some, statistics in or some evidence-based material, that's good. But you don't want to get too bogged down by that. You want to keep it simple. You're not going to solve the world's problems in 750 or 800 words. You want to get across one clear message and what you want to happen in the workplace, what has happened to you, an idea you have that might make it better. Figure out what direction you want to go, and then keep everything along those lines. You can't you have to throw things out if they distract from the narrative that you're trying to get across. You can't put in everything, so you have to kind of be ruthless about what makes it into your op-ed piece. And again, personal, opinionated, passionate. Those are three guidelines to keep in mind. And with that, I would turn it over to Clarence, who's really the master here.
All right, Clarence, you're up.
Well, Eleanor is much too flattering there, I must say, but thank you very much. I really envy Eleanor and her wonderful capacity for ideas and reporting and digging up some very original angles on stories that everybody else is covering, but somehow she'll find a point that they all missed, or some person who gives a special insight into it. And all of these skills are important when you're writing op-ed pieces. She talks about reporting. I started out as a reporter who always had the dream in the back of my head to be a columnist. And speaking of nerds, that was how I started back in high school on my high school newspaper, because I didn't have much of a social life and thought this would be a good way to meet girls, which all comes back to me now during the controversies over Justice Kavanaugh, or I should say Judge Kavanaugh. I think we all are inside whatever we were in high school, and you discover this when you go to enough high school reunions. But I do digress. I did get started as a writer on my high school paper, and found that when people ask me how I learned journalism, I will at some point mention that everything I know about reporting and writing really I learned on my high school newspaper, because just putting out a newspaper every 2 weeks where we had to interview real people and write about real people, you learn that things that might not mean much to you, like somebody else's middle name, may mean everything to them. And you're always being held accountable every day for things like facts and accuracy. This is something that, again, comes up to a lot of discussion these days. But while I was researching, while I was preparing for this webinar today, I learned something, and this is why it does pay to go out and do some research and reporting. You may have heard of a woman named Haben Girma. She is an American with Ethiopian and Eritrean or Somalian parents, as I recall, who were both refugees, came to the U.S. as refugees. And she is both blind and hearing impaired, a beautiful woman who was able to get through the school system, got through high school and college, graduated from Harvard Law School. I think she's the first deaf and blind person to get through Harvard Law School, and quite a sensation. And I was reading a piece that she did about the removal of Helen Keller from the school curricula in Texas during their latest revisions of their curricula, and she wrote a wonderful piece about why it's important to know about Helen Keller and her story. And it's a great example of what an op-ed piece should do on many levels that Eleanor just mentioned. For example, the idea that you start with. In this case, the idea was pinned to the news, which is also important increasingly now in this era of the Internet, where people get an idea, they turn around and they type it out right there, and boom, it's on the web. Everything moves much faster now than it did when I first started in newspapers. And newspapers themselves, in fact, are viewed now from a business point of view as really what they're the permanent version of what you get on the web, but the web is really viewed as the center of our new business model now, because as everybody knows, fewer and fewer people are getting their news and views on paper, and more on the web. And but that doesn't change anything for us as far as being newspaper news or opinion writers. What we do is basically the same. It's just being done more electronically now, more often digitally than on paper. But the principles that Eleanor just spelled out are the same. I start out with the idea. Figure out, and this is very important. I learned this from watching and reading George Will years ago. He said the toughest part of being a columnist is the lead that Eleanor just mentioned. That he'll spend like 60% of his time just figuring out what the lead is going to be, and once you've got that, the rest tends to fall into place. The outline, structure, etc. There's a lot of truth to that. I have more times than a few. I started off with a lead in mind that even I'm not fully satisfied with, but I'll say to myself, oh, well, by the time I get to the end, I'll figure out exactly what I want to say. And more often than not, it takes me twice as long to get to the end, to get to that first draft, because I didn't have a firm idea in my head of what the whole point of this piece was. So I can't stress enough the value of focusing as much as you can, tightening up, rewriting, or fiddling around with it. Just don't take forever until you've got a lead you're comfortable with and that inspires you to move on. The argument itself, they are called op-ed because they're opposite the editorial page, and they're also called that stands also for opinion. We are opinion writers. And so it's not a question here of getting all the facts. It's a question of having some point of view, and that helps people to get their own answers or come up with their own opinion. I guess it was Ben Bagdickian, the late media professor and guru, who said that it is I don't want to lose his slogan here. He said, I cannot tell you what to think, but I offer you something to think about. And that's the difference here. We can't tell people what to think, and that shouldn't be our job or our purpose. But we want to give people something to think about and enough information and enough of an interpretation so they can come up with their own opinion that may or may not agree with ours, but we want to make this the most powerful argument that we can for the position that we are presenting in the op-ed essay. The structure is the basic outline is important, but one thing I've learned over time is even more important than the outline is what's the story. People like to hear stories. We journalists are basically storytellers, whether we do it with paper and ink or electronically. We are, I always use the example of the Bible is a big book of stories. And we all know, I know of very few people who can tell me what all 10 commandments are. The 10 Commandments are something that most of us don't sit down and memorize. We don't really have to. But everybody I know can tell me how Moses got the 10 Commandments, the story of how the 10 Commandments were written, how Moses went up the mountain and came down with these words from God. That story is what we remember, and that story is the real guide to the power of the Bible. It's full of stories that tell us this and tell us that, give us something to think about. It's a there's also a wonderful quote from Maya Angelou that I oftentimes use, that people will not remember what you said, but they'll always remember how you made them feel. And that is so important. Now, in my years of covering politics and various figures and all, I've heard many speeches, and Eleanor's right that it's important to use simple words, simple sentences, make pointed and concise statements, because those are the most memorable. They have the most impact, and they are the type of statements and ideas that are most long remembered. But that aspect of how you made them feel can mean more than anything. I've covered politicians from this party and that party. Some had tremendous ideas, were great thinkers. Others didn't have half a brain. But very often, the politician who didn't have half a brain, if he or she was a good speaker, if they could tell the kind of story that had the audience listening to them and could motivate them to action, that was how they wound up getting elected. Because people didn't, you hear this all the time, that folks don't really trust politicians, blah, blah, blah. But there's always somebody that they love. There's somebody that they put their faith in. And why does that happen? Because that person made a connection with them through those speeches and media appearances. I'm not naming any names here, but I'm sure we can all think of some examples of this phenomenon. And so once you've got the idea, I think, we're talking in the context of an organization that is concerned with people with disabilities. And that was really how I came across the piece by Hoppengerma. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, because this was a piece which was talking about how important it is to understand people like Helen Keller and how she succeeded as well as she did. The lessons that are to be learned from her, whether you have disabilities or not, are very important. And it was a wonderful essay, and it was timely because it was written in response to news that's breaking right now. And these days, as I say, more and more it's important to be able to peg your piece to some kind of topic that is in the news or that people are talking about right now. And that is that can make a big difference on what your subject matter is, and it's up to you to come up with what the angle, what the argument is that you're going to make. But these days, now being able to know where to pitch your idea and how to do it can be more important than ever because of the speed with which more and more. I think here particularly of the newspaper that really kicked off the term op-ed, and that was the New York Times back in, as I recall, it was in 1969 when I was starting my career, that they came up with the idea of having an opinion page opposite the editorial page that would give alternative views and open up dialogue, and over time, and it didn't take very long that other newspapers across the country started publishing and expanding their own op-ed pages. So these days, that still offers an opportunity to get your point of view out. And I've seen more often than not editors who really were looking for somebody who had a good alternative view on some breaking development. And they were frustrated because they didn't know where to call, or somebody would suggest an idea, but they couldn't put it together and write it in time, or focus on the topic well enough. Or, as I said, the one mistake I've seen people make more often than anything else is writing too long. It's a sign of an amateur, you might say, that people who go beyond that 700-word, more or less, size that Eleanor was talking about. People are getting more sophisticated about this now as more folks have more computer power at home and all. So I suppose that mistake isn't made as often. People there aren't that many amateurs around anymore in terms of understanding media, or at least let's say people are getting more informed. But I think that's something to think about, though, because in other words, if you've got a good idea, don't sit around and ruminate on it too long. Immediately let somebody know if possible. And newspapers tend to have now some kind of a box or notice somewhere in the neighborhood of the opinion pages that invites you to submit your own opinion, whether it's a letter to the editor or at our newspaper we call it Perspective, the Perspective page, the view for those who want to submit something. I was surprised over time talking with our editors how they get a lot of letters to the editor, don't get that many op-ed pieces because a lot of folks just aren't thinking about that or don't know how it works, or they submitted one a year ago and it wasn't accepted, so they felt discouraged and just never tried again. All of these things happen, but about every op-ed page editor I know will say, "Oh yeah, we invite more opinions. We want people to write in, and a diversity of the people who write in. They want more women. Well, traditionally, it's been a page for white guys. Black guys like me help to break that up somewhat, and other people of color. There still aren't as many women, but I've been gratified to see in recent years more and more female columnists getting more attention and more prominence and having more of an impact. So we're moving in the right direction anyway. But I think a lot of folks just aren't encouraged to even try to submit an opinion, and I think they would be more encouraged if they knew or had had a chance to talk with some of the editors I've talked to, and also understood that's not rocket science, although I oftentimes have wished it was. I originally wanted to go into rocket science, but I hit higher math, and when I got into calculus and physics, I said maybe journalism would be a more inviting career, and so I wound up here. But I think what's his name, Tyson, Dr. McNeil Tyson. He has the job I really wanted to have, which is to not only be able to fiddle around with rockets in space, but also be able to write about it and tell the public about it in a way that any ordinary person would be able to understand and be as fascinated by it as I was. So I always try to get that spirit in my head when I'm working on an op-ed piece, and I invite you all to do the same. I eagerly look forward to your questions and comments. So I hope I've made enough sense, but I'll be happy to try to make some more.
All right. Clarence Page is officially the Neil deGrasse Tyson of the Chicago Tribune. I love it.
Thank you. Now I know the name again.
All right. So here's how the rest of the webinar is going to go. I'm going to talk you guys through some details, some statistics to kind of get those opinions and those thoughts going, so you have a solid basis of kind of the critical ideas that we want to see shared for National Disability Employment Awareness Month. And then after I wrap that up, we're going to have a chance to go back for Clarence and Eleanor to have you ask questions. I've got some questions. We'll get a good dialogue going. And so we've covered a lot of the big reasons why there's a need for op-eds and why we want people out there in the world to put out an op-ed for October. It's a chance to, raise the issue of disabilities, to raise the idea of jobs as a solution. And it gives you a chance to change public opinion. Somebody somewhere is going to click on that and say, hey, I never thought of that before. They're going to think that, hey, maybe I can hire somebody with a disability in my job. And that will be a great chance to change somebody's life, change somebody's perspective, and, start that very slow, painful process of changing the world. So I want to start with some statistics just as an example of kind of something you need a foundation. Yes, it's about opinions, but opinions are better offered when armed with facts. And so this slide has an overview of our home state, Maryland. It's got a picture of Larry Hogan, who's up for re-election currently, and has some key statistics. We mention these statistics because they're important. They give perspective on where things stand. So these statistics show that Maryland has a 40% employment rate for people with disabilities. Put it another way, put it more simple language, it means only 4 out of 10 people have jobs. People with disabilities have jobs. That's a number that people can wrap their heads around. You can start talking about more details like gaps in employment rates or differences in labor force participation rates, but a really hard-hitting number like 40% of people with disabilities in Maryland have jobs, meaning that 60% don't. That will get your point across. That will raise eyebrows. And you can find these kind of statistics for your state on our website at respectability.org. So something that's really important to engage with if you're going to write an op-ed is you need to really talk about some of the social dimensions of inclusion and some of the conceptions around how people perceive minority groups. There's been a lot of social science studies about how do people react and regard. You hear people talking about the phrase of unconscious bias. And so this slide here has a plot of kind of the universal dimensions of social cognition. And there's 2 universal dimensions, warmth and competence. And when you really dig into bias, when you really dig into the way that people look at others, the 2 most important factors are warmth and competence, as competence is obviously your ability to do a task, to do a job, to do something well, and warmth is personability. And that's really at the foundation of both prejudice in terms of people thinking people are not competent and people are not warm, but also, inclusion. And so the critical findings from this research study showed that a lot of people who aren't in the disability community think of people with disabilities as being warm, but they don't think about them as being competent. And so a well-written op-ed really needs to drive home the message that people with disabilities bring incredible talents to the workplace, that with the right supports and services, people with disabilities can achieve the American dream just like anyone else. And so that's something important to think about as you're trying to offer an opinion about what people can do. As Clarence and Eleanor said, you got to think about your audience. Is this, if you're going to shoot for your biggest paper in your state, then you want to think about a state audience. If you've got a local paper, maybe think about just, what can you talk about in your local area? How can you make this? Maybe there's a local business that has a lot of employees with disabilities. Then tell the story of that. Think about, who's your audience? Who do you want to reach? How do you want to reach it? Will facts move their brains? Well, Clarence raises a good point that, emotion is most important sometimes. So, maybe you don't have a happy story with as a job seeker with a disability. Maybe you have, really struggled to find that opportunity, and maybe that's the story you want to tell. Don't have it be, don't accept pity, offer high expectations, talk about your persistence, talk about what you want to accomplish, talk about your dreams, but tell your story honestly and truly, and that's important. There's a kind of an essential principle when it comes to persuasive writing. There's 3 categories of people, and this slide has a picture of different crowds and a red hash mark over a disability sign. First and foremost, there's the choir. There's people talk about your base in politics. The choir is the amen choir. These are people who are just like you, who think just like you, who vote just like you. And you know what? They're going to be there with you. They're not the people you need to talk to with an op-ed. They're not the people you need to persuade. Likewise, there will always be people who will disagree with you. There will always be people who who are unpersuadable. It's the folks in the middle that you got to reach, and that's what op-eds can do. Our focus when it comes to writing about these things is very much around youth with disabilities. Young folks with disabilities are out there, they're graduating high school, they're going into apprenticeship programs, they're trying to go to college, and it's a critically important kind of demographic to talk about. There's about 1.2 million youth with disabilities in America today. About 2/3 are going to graduate from high school, but you know what? Hundreds of thousands of them aren't. And if it's a success or it's a struggle to be a success, that's a story which can be told, a story that can be powerful. And all of these kind of information statistics are, again, available from respectability.org. As Clarence and Eleanor said, there are the professionals here, but, you don't have to be a professional to get published. If you have a passionate opinion, if you have a great story, that can get out there. You have to, do some research. You have to find your paper. You have to figure out what you can write, what you want to write, and you have to be persistent in resending, re-editing until it's ready. But you'll reach that point. And as Clarence said, do your research, be accurate, make sure you help people understand why your issue is important. And, 1 in 5 Americans has a disability. It means that disability issues connect with every aspect of American life. Again, something that's important is you got to keep it simple. I say this as somebody who's very guilty of laying on a lot of facts and a lot of figures and not a lot of heart in whatever I write. But avoid jargon, avoid technical terms. Yes, it's very easy to get caught up in IEPs and 504 plans and WIOA and CTE and CIE and all of these different pieces of jargon that are part and parcel of disability employment as a larger topic, but none of that means anything to, the store manager who you want to persuade to hire somebody who has a disability. So keep it really simple. Personal experience is especially important. We'll use it, I was saying that time and again. Again, the facts need to be accurate. I was just reading a piece from a disability publication, and they made a mistake in thinking, this is not. They didn't acknowledge that the study in question was a non-generalizable sample, meaning that they were putting out claims that were radically unreflective of the document they were quoting. So you got to be accurate. Now, when you're talking about disabilities, you got to talk about the power of words. And here's, we always talk about the importance of person-first language, and I have a colleague glaring at me who is very much in favor of the identity-first language instead, but that's kind of a search your heart and you know how you best to talk about yourself, talk about disability issues. If that doesn't mean anything to anybody, please ignore me and keep going on and use person-first language. Structure is very important. Clarence talked about why it's important to have an outline. As Eleanor said, you got to have your points. You got to get them across. You can't bury the lead. You got to be straight up, straightforward, and tell them what you're going to tell them. So your first paragraph has to really introduce your topic. You got to say, this is my story of job hunting. This is my story of success as an employee with disabilities. This is my story of my company, which is inclusive of people with disabilities. You got to have a solid topic. In this case, we're challenging people to write about employment for National Disability Employment Awareness Month. Then state your argument. I was to be able to succeed because I had this help, I had this program, I went to my local job board. Whatever that argument is, then you got to back it up with some facts. You can get some of those key facts from our website, some key statistics that are really persuasive and important, things around where does your state rank compared to other states, how many working age people with disabilities are in your state. Excuse me, I'm coming down with a cold, so anyway. Your employment rate as a state is also important. So all of those facts and figures come together in a well-written op-ed. When you're first writing, you have to be your own harshest critic. You have to be really critical of, is this important information? Does it make my point across? That's important. As Clarence and Eleanor both said, length is very important, and by length I mean the shorter the better. As they said, 500 words. I've seen a lot of state newspapers that request 200-word op-eds, which is not a lot of word space to get a point across, because people with disabilities is 3 words, for example. But, take a grindstone, go over it again and again, read it out loud, have your children read it, have your neighbors read it, get as much perspective as you can, and don't be afraid to edit and re-edit before you submit. We are the opportunity agenda when it comes to employment for people with disabilities. RespectAbility is deeply committed to showcasing success. It's deeply committed to really showing the flat fact of the matter that employment for people with disabilities works. It helps make business better. It brings innovation and success. There's a lot of great examples and role models, such as Haben Girma, of successful people with disabilities who are changing the world. So it's always important to reemphasize key facts like the fact that, studies show most people with disabilities want to work and that they're striving to work. And you can also point out to a lot of companies that, are being successful because they're being inclusive employers. So, for example, this slide has a bunch of different facts that are important. There's 56 million Americans with disabilities. That means 1 in 5. That is, our neighbors, our friends, our loved ones, ourselves. Interestingly, 51% of voters have some kind of disability connection. 70% of working age people with disabilities may not be working now, but they want to work. Disability is the largest minority group in the country. It is the only minority group that anyone can join at any time due to accident, illness, or injury. Those are all facts that are very, very important and very persuasive. We talk a lot on our website about, the company benefits, the bottom line dollars of what inclusive employment means, and those are all important. If you're talking, say, business to business, talk about turnover rates, and if there's been a change in turnover rates or training or cost. For the positive, those are all things that can be very persuasive. Having a diverse, inclusive workforce that looks like your customers, reflects their diversity, that means better business. There's a lot of other great examples of model employers out there that you can invoke. The Kessler Foundation has a lot of great examples, as does the Poses Family Foundation. Google them, Google case studies, disability employment. You'll find millions of articles about these things. And it's important to acknowledge the challenges, too, about stereotypes, about bias, about stigma. But again, positive messages are going to be more persuasive. Something we bring up, you'll see this, if you actually go through a lot of respectability work, you'll see this phrase a lot. And that is JP Morgan Chase, Coca-Cola, UPS, SAP, EY, IBM, Starbucks, and Walgreens are great examples of companies with successful disability inclusion programs. Big names like that really get people's attention. I mean, we've all bought stuff or opened accounts with or drank a soda from those companies. Those are companies that are part and parcel of American life, and they are inclusive employers of people with disabilities. And they're all successful, and they showcase what people can do. You can go to places like the Workplace Initiative, find some case studies. You can find under RespectAbility's website the RespectAbility campaign. Likewise, the organization now known as Disability In, formerly known as USVLN, has a great index they put out every year of inclusive employers. Check that out if you want some great examples. And so this is a big block of text which I'm going to dive into. And there are really two messages that are really powerful, very persuasive when it comes to employment for people with disabilities. And they're messages that we have time and again tested and we've seen can really reach diverse audiences. And first and foremost is the idea that our nation was founded on the idea that anyone who can get ahead in life deserves an equal opportunity. Let me pull up the exact language. Our nation was founded on the principle that anyone who works hard should be able to get ahead in life. People with disabilities deserve equal opportunity to earn an income and achieve independence just like anyone else. If you take anything away from this webinar, I want you to write that phrase down and the phrase I'm next going to read. People with disabilities bring unique characteristics and talents to the workplace. People with disabilities can work in hospitals, hotels, apply their talents in computer coding, software, website design. There are no limits to what they can do. We have been working on multiple different public opinion polls that really show that those are stories, those are words that really change people's minds. So take it, live it, and make good use of it. We talk about having a message triangle. The idea is, when you start outlining an op-ed, think about what are the most important pieces that you want people to think about, what do you want them to take away from it, the idea of principle, of equality, opportunity, things like that. Because we, as an organization, do a lot of work with state leadership, we think it's always very valuable to mention governors. Governors like to hear their name in good news and don't like to hear their name in bad news. So say your state is on the bottom 10 of the worst states with the worst job outcomes for people with disabilities. An op-ed runs in a big paper that says, well, Governor X of state Y isn't doing enough to support jobs for people with disabilities. That might get their attention. And if you get their attention, they might do something about it for the positive. So think about that. Again, this slide has a lot of tiny little font, but we have statistics for each and every state up on our website. If you want to know what Connecticut is compared to California, want to know where New York ranks compared to Washington State, it's all there on our website at respectability.org. Brought this up before, but I'm going to reiterate it again. Employer heroes, companies that are being inclusive, you got to look at those. Something that I'd say is flag an issue of particular importance is Section 503. A lot of businesses that have contracts with the federal government have a legal requirement to hire people with disabilities. 1 in 5 American businesses is a federal contractor, and if you're a federal contractor over a certain size, you are supposed to be hiring people with disabilities in all job categories. So maybe you are interested in that particularly, so write about that. And there's lots of great links on our website that can give you further information about that. Maybe you want to talk more about where the ADA stands now in relation to employment. Well, that's great. The Department of Labor has a great ADA website that has information you can pull together about the history of disability rights and occupations. I'd say check out their website, so dol.gov, search for their ADA section. It's really got some great information. Then, lastly, when it comes to kind of telling your story, you got to figure out, you're going to go statewide, you're going to go for your local paper. Do some research on Google, figure out who you want to send this to, and send it out there. You need to know who you're sending it to, so you got to figure out, is it an editorial board, is it an opinion editor? Do your research, find out who they are, get their email, get their phone number, prepare an email with your finalized op-ed, copy and paste the final op-ed with your name and your phone number and your email into the body of the email. That's usually the rule of thumb. I will tell you some newspapers have online forms you have to submit, but as a rule of thumb, in all likelihood, they have a designated email box for op-eds. Take that email, copy and paste your op-ed into the body of your email with your name, your phone number, your title, your organization, if you're writing in that capacity, and then hit send. Usually they don't take attachments, so keep that in mind. Different publications have different guidelines. Again, check the rules, do your research, Google around, and, maybe you want to start with the biggest paper in your state, but maybe there's a second or third one that might take it instead. Be persistent. You have to submit something first, and then if they don't publish it, there's nothing that says you can't take that. It's the same thing, and go to the next biggest paper. Also, it's not likely, but maybe there's a reporter who has a special interest in disability issues. RespectAbility back on July 30th honored Joe Shapiro and Judy Woodruff because they are both amazing, talented national journalists who have a great stake in disability issues. And you know what? Maybe there's some local person who has some kind of connection to disability and would be a great connection, or maybe somebody to get a story published with. Our website has lots of examples of different op-eds that we publish on a variety of different topics. We encourage you to kind of look at them and be inspired by our hard work and by the hard work of others that we care about. And so I've been doing a lot of talking, and I've coughed up a bit. So I'm very happy to pivot to a Q&A session. So Eleanor and Clarence, I'm going to queue you up. On the bottom left, you'll see the Q&A box. So if you have a question you'd like to ask for Clarence or Eleanor or me, type it in there. I see a couple that are queued up. Operator, can you tell us, for folks who are on the phone, how phone attendees can ask a question?
Participants who have dialed in for audio and who would like to ask a question can press 7# on their telephone keypad to indicate they'd like to speak. Again, that's 7 followed by the pound sign on your telephone keypad to indicate you would like to speak. All participants can submit questions by typing them in the bottom of the Q&A box and using their mouse to click on the Ask button to send it.
Great. Thank you. All right, so our first question, a bit of a long one, here we go. Major newspapers such as the New York Times and WashPo use opinion@blank.email addresses for all submissions. Or they say they do a variety of high-profile individuals, seems to place op-eds over and over. The question is, I find it difficult to believe that the only way to submit them is via general email addresses. Is there any secret to pitching stories in a way other than just those general email addresses?
This is Eleanor. Yes, I think that the Washington Post gets something like 400 submissions. It might be a day, or else it's a week. Yes, if you know someone on the editorial page, if you have a personal relationship, yes, and can get them to submit it for you, that would be far better. But I don't think you don't necessarily need to start at the top, that you got to get into one of the major, almost national newspapers. But if you really have something that that other people besides yourself think really merits going to the top, then I certainly don't want to deter you from it. But I think the Washington Post is a very difficult op-ed page to crack.
Yeah. Well, I've tried, and that hasn't got me anywhere.
I would certainly agree with all of that. At the same time, though, editors do read those letters, essays, op-ed submissions that come in through the general email number or address, rather. I say this because I've been surprised by how many people are surprised to hear that I read my own emails. that I really they'll say right on the after I've responded to them, they will say something like, "Oh, you really do read these things, huh?" Or "Gee, I didn't know you actually read these emails." And for those people who are just sending some critique or whatever, I've often found that what may be an angry attitude in the first email will be much mellower when they find out that somebody really does read them. But I have gotten op-ed submissions myself from people who either know me or know who I am and say, could you put in a good word with the op-ed editor for me, because they don't believe they're going to get inside the paper if they just send to the general address. And all I do is turn around and just give it to the op-ed editor and say, here's another one for you, because basically she's going to look at them all from the standpoint of what's going to look good or what's going to work in the paper. If it's a piece that is expressing an opinion that is worth getting in the paper, in her view, or somebody else who's working with her, she will get back to them if she thinks there ought to be some kind of a change, like it's too long, or some other change that she thinks needs to be made, but that she really does want to run. That's the main motivation. We want to try to get a variety of pieces. I've seen times when we've gotten so many anti-Trump submissions that she will deliberately look for somebody who in some way is supporting Trump's position so that we can have some semblance of balance. And this sort of thing happens about every day. So I only encourage people to go ahead and pitch it and see if they can get into the paper that way or get onto the website. If not, there's probably someplace else that they can pitch it.
That's a good point. The Washington Post has a website which also probably publishes more pieces than get in the print version. The other thing, though, is if you pitch to the Washington Post or the New York Times, you can't also be sending it somewhere else. They're very particular about exclusivity. So if you want to include them, you can't pitch it to half a dozen places or even one other place. And it's frustrating. I know for people, I know friends who are professionals, and they don't get back to you right away, and then sometimes the moment passes. So it's a competitive world. But if you're playing off the news and you have a unique angle, you have a leg up. But now if you're pitching pieces, which is what we're talking about, to take advantage of October, sort of highlighting employment for people with disabilities, I think the op-ed pages will be looking for something that is either, again, positive or a story where somebody who clearly had a setback and is reacting and readers could have empathy with. I think that would be an angle that editors would be looking for.
Definitely, and that actually helps cover a question that we had in the chat box that, what is the usual turnaround on decisions about op-ed pieces? I assume that simultaneous submissions are not allowed, but the same place can be subsequently submitted if rejected. So,
right.
Well, the turnaround you can see very often just by looking at the New York Times or the Washington Post op-ed page, and you see a piece that is responding to something that happened yesterday. or the day before yesterday. In other words, very very shortly before publication. So you can see that every effort is made to try to be on top of the news, and so the turnaround time can be remarkably fast. Sometimes I wonder how the Times goes through all the thousands of pieces they get every day, but they manage to do it.
So for a state paper, I'd say, give them a week. You don't hear anything, try somewhere else. But again, it's not a hard and fast rule, and you'll kind of get it. If this is something you want to do, you'll get a sense of it pretty quickly. I know we have a couple phone questions waiting for us. So, operator, phone questions, please and thank you.
Yes, we have a question from Carol. One moment, please.
That's me?
Hello, Carol? Yes.
Hi, Carol.
Hi. It's just such a pleasure to be talking to you guys. I'm so impressed with both of you, Mr. Page and Ms. Clift. But anyway,
Thank you.
let me say this quickly. I have submitted something to the Boston Globe about, we have a bill in Massachusetts about accessibility for workplaces. And the state law in Massachusetts right now does not require that workplaces be accessible. So we have a law that's part of the building code, and it's outrageous. And we've been trying to get this passed for, I think, 16 years. It just failed again, and it failed because of the deep pockets in this state that don't want to have to make private, workplace offices that are not open to the public, just workplaces, accessible. They don't want to put in money for that. Anyway, so I submitted a piece. It was rejected because 4 years ago I submitted a piece that was accepted. It was in the online, the podium part of the Boston Globe. And so they said it was too similar to what I put in 4 years ago. And I'm saying, yeah, that's the point. But anyway, she said, you need something to move the ball forward. And we'll look at it if you submit it again. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas. I don't know if I explained enough to move the ball forward. I put in a lot of personal stories because I used to be on this board, the Architectural Access Board, and about how many jobs we had to give away because we couldn't make offices accessible. Anyway, but I didn't have a personal person story. So that's one thing I've thought about. But if you have any other ideas about how to move the ball forward.
Well, I would point out that this issue has been before the legislature for 4 years, and I would
16.
point out for how many years?
16 years.
Okay, all right, and I would say why, because just what you said now, it's the special interests. I think you need to, and if you can zero out.
I said that, and that was I did say that, and it was rejected. They said that wasn't enough. But go ahead. I'm sorry, I won't interrupt you.
Well, to point the finger at what the holdup is, and then maybe find someone who was personally hurt by this, again, to bring in the personal story.
Yep.
Yeah, because you're writing at a time when there's, great distrust of government, and this is maybe the angle is this, this is why government doesn't work, or this is why voters should be angry at government. Maybe just a slightly different angle.
One thing,
help.
I would say, first of all, welcome to our world, because reporters run into this all the time with their editors. We wrote about this 5 years ago, so it's still there. It's still a problem, but you've got to make it sound while on the first hand saying that this is a problem has been around a while. The first thing to do is talk about what's happening now. In other words, you may have the same points to make now that you had to make 10 years ago, but something new has happened that has now brought the same problem up again, and then you can say, after, first of all, taking a position on what's happening right now, say, this has been with us for a while. This is not new, and here it comes again. So it's like there are different ways of freshening up an old issue, but the best way to do it is to focus on what's happening now and what people can do now. I'm thinking now about even as we speak, because columnists never stop thinking about the next column. I've been ruminating over the issue of Supreme Court appointments and what's happened since Anita Hill, and how much has changed and what hasn't. I've got an automatic news that's going on, which is the current controversy over Kavanaugh. But we also saw the reemergence of Anita Hill this week. And so this gives me, the question came to my mind, well, what has happened since Anita Hill? And she herself wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times the other day, which is about how she took the positive, forward-looking angle of, I hope Congress can get it right this time, and here's how. So rather than refight the old argument, because that would, I won't say nobody cares about that anymore. Of course they care. But what happened back in, 1992 with
91, right.
91, even longer ago. Yeah, with Hill and Thomas. What happened then has been argued and re-argued. That's not our issue now. The question now is how far have we come? How far do we have to go? And so I try to focus on that. And good luck.
All right, Carol.
I just thank you so much. I can't believe it.
Carol, you have your editorial orders from Clarence and Eleanor themselves.
Yes, on the great. So, I know. Okay, thank you.
Well, we are just about out of time. Liddell Lockwood had a great point about how the Washington Post, if you're in the D.C. metro area, does have regional sections for like Nova and Maryland, and that, if you work up, if you can get published in kind of lower level things, maybe you can start swinging to the big leagues. So thank you for that, Liddell. So Clarence, Eleanor, I want to thank you both so much for your time and your insights and your clear personal passion for all of this. I am humbled to be here today with you guys. Thank you so much for all your hard work. Thank you very much for contributions, your insights. Thank you very much to our audience. Please be in touch with the staff here at RespectAbility if you feel the bug to go out and write something about jobs for people with disabilities. I'd say remember those two messages that we really talked about. The fact that again, it's a call to the idealism of what makes us Americans, that our nation was founded on the principle that anyone who works hard in life should be able to get ahead. People with disabilities deserve equal opportunity to earn an income and achieve independence just like anyone else. Think about that message. Take it out there. Reach out with the message that people with disabilities bring unique characteristics and talents to the workplace. People with disabilities can work in hotels and hospitals, apply themselves in computer software, website design. There are no limits to what they can do. So we encourage you to take out those messages. If you have questions or comments or want to get involved, you can contact our amazing volunteer director, coordinator, outreach. I'm messing up her title. I apologize, but Debbie Fink is your woman. Her email is debbief@respectability.org. You can reach out to me. You can find us on our website, respectability.org, with all the state's statistics you could ever use for any op-eds that you write. So good luck. Go out there and change the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hear, hear. Bye-bye.